Hola, buenos días. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much to Miguel for your wonderful introduction and amazing generosity. It's very exciting for me to be here, not only to give a talk, but also to make research and make studio visits in Bilbao. And particularly exciting to see this amazing idea here at the Museo de Bellas Artes in Bilbao of the alphabet. Panofsky once said that we always invent the future with fragments from the past. And it was very, very inspiring yesterday to spend time in this rule of the game, really, how to revisit in such a dynamic way a collection. I'm also very grateful to Isabella Mora, as Miguel said, and also, of course, very excited that this morning my talk happens in the same session as the talk of Elena Ochoa-Foster, because, of course, Elena is going to talk about books. And I think it's wonderful that when we talk here about the future of the museum, about curating, that books have, through Elena, such a central point, because in a way, books are one of the essential platforms of exhibition making, because when artists make books, that's as important as when they make exhibitions. And it's still one of the most, I think, least visible part of art history, and will become so much more important in the years to come. As Anthony Powell once says, book furnish a room, and Lawrence Wiener quoted him. So this is a very exciting connection, I think, which is here today. So I want to talk a little bit about the beginnings, because Miguel thought it would be interesting to talk about the beginnings. I started as a teenager to visit artist studio when I was like 16, 17. And one of the first studio visits was Peter Fischli and David Weiss, the Swiss artists, the legendary Swiss artists. And I didn't really know where to start to make exhibitions. So Fischli Weiss realized, and it connects to the books, they realized that I have books everywhere in my apartment, also in the kitchen, because I would never cook. So they felt, we needed to liberate the kitchen from the books, and had this idea that we could do an exhibition in my kitchen. So this exhibition had a budget of 300 Swiss francs, maybe 200 euros, was a student budget. And it happened during 3 months in my tiny, student apartment in St. Gallen. And over 3 months, it had 29 visitors, and it subsequently became a rumor. You can see here the altar Fischli Weiss built, and it was a beginning, of an interest I had, which never went away, to organize exhibitions in unexpected contexts, in unexpected locations. I think it's always very interesting, when you encounter art where you expect it least, because you would not necessarily expect an exhibition in a kitchen. And it's something which later on became a curatorial method, that we keep surprising the viewer by having art in places where we do not expect it. One artist, Hans-Peter Feldmann, decided that he did not want to exhibit in the kitchen, but he wanted to exhibit in the fridge. So he arranged it for feathers and marble eggs to be exhibited in the fridge. So within the kitchen exhibition, we had the fridge exhibition. And in a way, that became another methodology in most of my shows, that an exhibition can always hide another exhibition. It's almost like a Russian matryoshka. And later on, I started to curate in museums. From the kitchen, I got a grant at the Cartier Foundation. I moved to Paris and started to work at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris. So in a way, the venues became much bigger, the spaces became much bigger. But I always kept this methodology every couple of years to do an exhibition in a house museum. Very often, these exhibitions happen in museums like dedicated to one person, like the Lina Bobardi House in Sao Paulo, or the Lorca House in Granada, or the Sir John Soane's House in London, and always a collaboration with Isabella Mora. It's an ongoing project. And of course, that leads us to the next of these house museum exhibitions. We have actually was in the Nietzsche House in Sils Maria, and was one of my first exhibition at the same time, more or less, as the kitchen, because I had realized that the great artist Gerhard Richter spent a lot of time in the Engadin. He spent a lot of time in the Swiss mountains. It's this magical valley, the Engadin, where the south and the north really meet. You have the glaciers, but then you have the light from Italy, and it's a really extraordinary oxymoron. It's almost on 2,000 meters altitude, and it has inspired generations and generations of artists and architects who can work there, write there, get ideas there. I have all my ideas there. Whenever I need ideas, I go to the Engadin. So we went there with Gerhard Richter, and he told me about the Nietzsche house. It's a house where Nietzsche wrote Zarathustra, and it's the first time there that we exhibited his little overpainted photographs, which you see here. So these are, basically from his atlas. He had never exhibited them before outside the atlas. It was the beginning of him showing this extraordinary work where his photographic, painting and his abstract painting somehow come together. They're like extraordinary small studies, but also works in their own right. And the exhibition again happened in the interstices of this Nietzsche house in Sils Maria. And that leads us right away, and you might wonder why, to the exhibition which opened the day before yesterday, which Miguel mentioned, which is the exhibition in Santander at the Botín Foundation, which is an exhibition I curated of the work of Alexander Calder. And this is actually a work in progress towards an exhibition project, a book project, we're going to do with Sandy Rohr and the Calder Foundation in Calder's house in Roxbury. This amazing house and studio where Calder used to live, and which is unchanged from when he left it. You still have the kitchen, you have all the tools, you have all the materials he used, you have the ink, you have the pen, everything exactly as he left it. And the idea will be to invite artists to go there and spend time, which is the case always with these house museum exhibitions. You know that we basically, with artists, go there, and artists can produce work which they would never do. But in the progress to this show, we realized this exhibition in Santander, which has to do with another kind of key methodology, which came at the very beginning of my curatorial practice, which is basically the unrealized project. Because after visiting Fischli Weiss in their studio in Zurich, when I was 17, our school went on a trip. The lycée, went on a trip to Rome, and Fischli Weiss said it's going to be really boring. We need to give you some artist contacts in Rome. So when you're bored with the school trip, can go to some studios. So they gave me the telephone number of Alighiero Boetti, the late visionary Italian artist. I rang him up, and he spent a day with me. And this was one of the most important days in my life. It's really all about mentorship. I think mentorship is so important. This day in Rome with Alighiero replaced for me, was like a shortcut in a way, because Alighiero Boetti explained to me that an artist in his or her or their life is kind of more or less always invited to do the same thing. They are invited to do museum shows, invited to do gallery shows, invited to do sometimes biennales, maybe once upon a time a documenta, sometimes a public commission. It's a very small, limited roster of things. And Boetti said no one ever listens to artists what artists really want to do. He said artists have many unrealized projects, so do architects, and we should listen to those. And rather than to squeeze the practice of the artist into these existing very narrow formats which we have in society and in the art world, we should actually try to expand those and then try to make these unrealized artist projects become a reality. So basically, Boetti gave me advice. He said that could be your work. You could eventually just always ask artists, what's your dream? What's your unrealized project? And it's what I've done ever since in thousands of conversations with artists. And here in Santander, we apply this rule of the game for the first time to a historic figure, because normally it's always in conversation with living artists. But here we apply it to a historic figure, to Alexander Calder, who is no longer there, and in close collaboration with the museum in Santander, the Botín Foundation, and of course with the Calder Foundation in New York, we went through the archives and mapped all the unrealized projects of Calder. Just to give you one example, this amazing sculpture was an unrealized project for a zoo, because basically Calder was invited by the architect of the zoo to realize the flora accompanying the fauna. So you have the animals in the zoo, and these would be the sculptures who would live with the animals, like some form of artificial nature. And you will see in the exhibition many more unrealized projects. You also see Calder's wish to go into public art, not only to collaborate with architecture but to go into public art, to paint a car, for a race car, to paint airplanes, to go beyond the circuits, which usually are the circuits where artists exhibit, which is, of course, very exactly what Alighiero Boetti meant. Alighiero Boetti said, I have a desire to do something, outside the museums and go with my art to the people. And in a way, the exhibition in Santander addresses that through Calder's, unrealized and partially unrealized projects. So I hope over the next couple of months you might find time maybe to go and visit and see all these unrealized projects and archives in Santander. The exhibition is designed by Renzo Piano in his own building. It's a floating architecture of the floating work of Calder in a floating display. So it's almost like a triple floating situation. Now, when we talk about this idea of going, towards the people and bringing art in unexpected contexts, another project from the 90s, and as Miguel said, I should talk a little bit about the beginnings. That's the last one I want to show from beginnings, is Do It. Do It was a project which came about in conversations with Christian Boltanski and Bertrand Lavier, and we discussed about this idea that it could be interesting to do an exhibition where artists would contribute instructions, how-to manuals, and people could just realize the exhibition. It was almost like an open source idea. Everybody could just do it. We would make a book of instructions, send it around the world, and art schools and museums all over the world could interpret these artworks in many different ways. So in a way, it's almost like the musical score of a composer, which can be performed in many different ways, which can be interpreted in many different ways. Some scores are very precise, other scores are open, purposely open, because the artist wants the interpretation range to be very wide. So this exhibition started in 1993, and you have, artists' instructions, choreographers like Anna Halprin or Felix Gonzalez Torres with his famous instruction of a candy piece, and where the visitors can take the candies away. And this show has happened 181 times so far. It has never stopped since 1993. So for 26 years, it's always happened somewhere. At this very moment in time, there are 5 versions of Do It in the United States. With ICI, we carried it into the schools. So the idea is that it's now part of the curriculum of students who at high school can realize these instructions of artists. So in a way, it has become an ever-evolving kind of exhibition, which grows organically over time. And of course, can also be realized by people very freely at home or wherever they want. It's basically an exhibition for everyone. And that is exactly what Tim Berners-Lee told me the other day, the inventor of the World Wide Web. It's interesting that a couple of weeks ago, we all celebrated in the world the 30th anniversary of the World Wide Web. It's an extraordinary invention which really transformed all our lives. And Tim Berners-Lee is very worried because he says that basically the idea of net neutrality, which was always the key vision he had for the World Wide Web, is somehow endangered. The idea now is that more and more we have a fast internet for people who pay, and we have a slow internet for people who don't pay. So Tim Berners-Lee says we have to vehemently resist that because he wants the World Wide Web there to be for everyone. He does not want people to be excluded. And that, of course, leads to a very important point in relation to exhibitions, in relation to museums, not only open source shows like Do It, but also museum shows, and it's the importance of free admission. I believe deeply that in the age of inequality, of exacerbated inequality, in big cities particularly strongly, it's very important that we make exhibitions which are there for everyone, which is why at the Serpentine we have 1.2 million visitors every year, and it's all free admission. Here you have actually the drawing Tim Berners-Lee made for us at the Serpentine, mapping his own invention. It's how he imagines the World Wide Web today. If you want to spend more time with it, because it's a quite complex map, one can download it from the website of the Serpentine and also of edge.org. Now, of course, this idea of this is for everyone leads us also to the pavilions. The pavilions which started in 2000 with Zaha Hadid when Julia Peyton-Johns invited her to do this first pavilion, and which we've basically evolved as a scheme over the years to come, because initially the scheme was always there for architects who had never built in England, and so many international architects had never built in England. But by the time around 2010, 12, many of the international architects had actually built, and so we wanted to open it up to be more generous to a younger, new generation. So here are a few examples of that. Su Fujimoto in 2013. These pavilions always happen on the lawn of the Serpentine in front of the gallery. They are there from June to October. Then they disappear, and then the next year another one pops up. And then, of course, the pavilions have a second life. So the Su Fujimoto Pavilion is now with the Luma Foundation in Tirana on the central square. So they always are very public. Another recent one by a younger architect is Miljan Radic or Francis Quiré. Youngest architect so far in the series is Frida Escobedo. And then, of course, just opened this week, actually last week, is Yunya Ishigami, the young architect from Japan who created this structure. You see it here from above, made out of 70 tons of slate. So it's actually very heavy, but strangely, it doesn't feel heavy at all. It seems to almost fly away. And of course, it's very organic. It connects to the nature. It connects to the park. You know, it brings the outside of the park inside, as you can see here, and really, you know, oscillates between inside and outside. Now, how does this connect to the quote of Tim Berners-Lee? It's interesting that a few months ago, I was dropped by a taxi driver in Kensington Garden because I had come back from a journey very early, like at 5 a.m. and 6 a.m., and I went straight away to the office. And so obviously the taxi driver assumed that no one would visit the Serpentine at 6 a.m. So he assumed that, you know, I would work there. And he said that he always wanted to talk to someone who works at the Serpentine. And I said, yes, I'm very happy to listen to his story, what he wants to tell me. And he said he wanted to tell me the story of his daughter, because he came last summer to Kensington Gardens on a Sunday walk, and all of a sudden, his daughter ran into the pavilion, and he had to go and fetch her. And he said he wanted to thank us because his daughter had some form of revelation and now wants to study architecture and become an architect. But that was only half of the story, because I asked him then if he had also seen our exhibitions, which of course are free admission. And he said no. And I said, why? And then there was a silence. And after, you know, about a minute of silence, he said, actually, he just thinks that museums are not for people like him. And so what that tells us is that we need to do more. Free admission is not enough. We need to, because of course there is a door, no? There's a threshold. So that means we need to go with art to the people. The pavilion has no doors. It's in the middle of the park. And that's of course also true for all the public artworks we are creating more and more. Cristo last year, or Sofia Almaria very soon, the young artist who will create a public sculpture, or the rock on top of another rock, or Fischli Weiss. This idea that we go outside and sort of, you know, in a way, go towards people in the park with our program. Or even more so, go into other neighborhoods, which is something which is happening more and more. Because of course, the new project now is embarking Dagenham, which is our education project. It's half an hour from London, and we realized that in this basically area of London, has the highest unemployment rate of teenagers and young people, and almost no one ever goes to London. So the idea, of course, there again is that we go into these different neighborhoods and that we need to kind of, you know, create more a network of places with the institution, not centralize, but more create an archipelago. And then, of course, the topic I announced of the talk of new experiments in art and technology refers to Billy Klu. It refers to something Billy Klu did in the 1960s when he brought together artists and engineers and technologists. And we felt at the Serpentine that it's an important moment to do that for today, which is why we appointed with Ben Vickers, an artist, to be our chief technology officer. So Ben Vickers is not only curating curator of digital art and an artist, but he's also now, as the CTO, defining a digital strategy of the institution. And one of the ideas which came out of that is in collaboration with Google to create a digital pavilion. A digital pavilion where basically our digital department, Google, our advisor David Arte, worked on this augmented architecture commission with Jakob Knut-Steensen. So whilst the analog pavilion of Ishigami connects to nature, you will have now the possibility with your tablet throughout the summer from July the 11th onwards to have actually an experience of a virtual pavilion, which you can see here. Now, Marshall McLuhan has noted the ability of art to anticipate the future. In the foreword to his book, Understanding Media, which is an interesting book to reread today, he calls art an early alarm system, which is pointing us to new developments in times ahead and allowing us to prepare to cope with them. To quote Marshall McLuhan, art as a radar environment takes on the function of indispensable perceptual training. In the year of 1964, when his book was first published, the artist Nam June Paik was just building his robot, K456, to experiment with the technologies that later on would start to influence society. He had worked with television earlier, had challenged its usual way of consuming, and actually made art with global live satellite broadcasts to use the new media less for entertainment, but to point us to their poetic and intercultural capacities. And that's, of course, what I think we need to achieve today, that we use all these new technologies which artists want to use, but not for entertainment, but to actually liberate a poetic and intercultural potential, which is, mostly still unused today. The Nam June Paiks of our time are working with the internet, with digital images, with artificial intelligence, and of course, as we can see here, with Jakob Knut-Steensen, with augmented reality. Another example for that is more recently the exhibition of Pierre Week, where actually these experiments in art and technology enter directly the exhibition program. Throughout the gallery, in Pierre's exhibition, you had large screens presenting images which began in the mind of a human. The brain activity is captured as a person imagines a specific situation that the subject has been prompted to think of. So you have to imagine that Pierre sent images to a laboratory in Japan. You had a scientist sitting at the machine. There was no direct connection. It was basically machine telepathy. It went directly with electrodes from the brain to the machine. And whilst the scientist looked at the images, the machine would search in its entire encyclopedic archive for those images. And that's exactly what Pierre showed us here. You see AI at work. And the interesting thing is that, of course, artificial intelligence is very much invisible, no? We know that it surrounds us. We know that it's becoming more and more important. We also know that it's threatening. It brings us back also to the early alarm system of Nam June Paik. We know at the same time that there is a great potential in a positive way. It's both, but we can't really visualize it. Now, Paul Klee, the artist, said in the 20th century that art can have the function to make the invisible visible. And that's exactly what artists do today. In this installation of Pierre Week, you had not only humans, but you had 100,000 flies. You had a permanent feedback loop with the screens. So the video is no longer a video. It's no longer a loop, because with a loop, it repeats, no? The video repeats and then it starts again. But here, it's permanently changing. It's like alive. And I think that that is one of the most exciting things right now happening in art, is that we have these new living organisms. Artists are creating artworks which are living organisms. And that's, of course, also true for Ian Cheng. It's another exhibition at the Serpentine last year. Ian has been developing these living animations which never repeat. Civilizations grow, civilizations disappear, new civilizations appear. These are permanently changing systems, and we can see them the next day or a month later or a year later, they will always be different. And what then Ian did for the show at the Serpentine is to go beyond these animations, and he created a character called Bob. Bob stands for Bag of Belief, and actually continued to evolve throughout the duration of the exhibition, and was the first artwork we ever exhibited which had a nervous system. And that, of course, led to a completely different reaction from the public. So if you look at the visitor book with the reaction, the golden book, with all the handwritten things, and then the digital comments, some people say, someone wrote, "I came all the way from Birmingham, but Bob ignored me." And somebody else wrote, "Bob was so nice to me, I came back every day of the show." So this creates a very different relationship to the artwork than you had before. Ian also developed an app so that actually all the visitors could potentially add their own Bob shrine. So it becomes participatory. And we could imagine, the exhibition lasted for 2 months, but you could imagine that such an artwork could actually be even permanently installed, and as long as there is electricity, would always continue to evolve. Now, another example for an experiment with art and technology, parallel to Ian, was Sondra Perry. Typhoon happened in our second space and explored the intersection of Black identity, digital culture, and power structures through video, media installation, and also performances. Sondra Perry makes work about blackness, about black femininity, and often takes her personal history as a point of departure, using digital tools ranging from blue screen technology to 3D avatars, as you can see here, to found footage from the internet, reflecting on these modes of representation and abstraction of black identity in art and media. To quote Sondra, "When making a piece, I want people to feel like they have space and agency." I think it's very interesting, no? That an artist can use technology, which often creates the opposite, deprives us of space and agency, so uses technology to actually give us space and agency. Perry also said, "I'm interested in thinking about how blackness shifts, morphs, and embodies technology to combat oppression and surveillance throughout the diaspora. Blackness is agile." So you can see here, of course, also a very political way of artists using technology. Now, another experiment with an exhibition which connects to technology was and is the exhibition of Arthur Jafa. A bit like Do It, it has become an exhibition which never stops. It's now at the Moderna Museum in Stockholm. It's going to go to Portugal after. Then it will go to Asia. It's already in its 7th incarnation, a show called A Series of Utterly Improbable Yet Extraordinary Events that has been shown basically both at the Serpentine and in many other venues in London. And the interesting thing is that Arthur Jafa said we need to actually consider that there are these many circuits today, and that museums can have a function to bring them all together. So rather than having a solo show of his work only, he wanted to have a group show of one artist here, Ming Smith, a forgotten photographer, because we should never forget that in the age of the internet, in the age of information, we have more and more information. It's an exponential growth of information every day, but that does not necessarily mean that we have more memory. It might actually be that somewhere amnesia is at the core of our digital age. First of all, in our own life, because we no longer often train our memory, because we just go on a search engine when we don't know something, but also because you have so many practices, artist practices, other practices, which are off the grid and then fall between the stools. So Arthur Jafa says there is this amazing African-American photographer, Ming Smith. I'm very upset that museums don't show her, and I want my exhibition to be a retrospective of this photographer. Here you see his own installation, a kind of a Gesamtkunstwerk with moving image, photography, and then miscellaneous, a musician who passed away who only existed on YouTube. So Arthur Jafa said, I want to bring him from YouTube to the museum to all of a sudden create another visibility. And interesting also the collages of Frida Oropedo, which are here on the left. It's difficult to see. Her work was only visible on Instagram. Everybody talked about her Instagram account and these amazing collages, but she had never exhibited in a museum. So Arthur Jafa said, I want her to come from Instagram into the museum. And all of a sudden now, she is exhibiting in galleries, in biennales, is in the art world. It created a whole crossover of her work. So it was very fascinating how all of a sudden, once more, the exhibition can be this place, which is why it's still my favorite medium. I love the idea that exhibitions can bring so many things together from different worlds, from different disciplines. It has a great freedom of format, because many years ago, I invited together with Rikrit, Tiravanit, who was also with us in Santander, and with Molly Nesbitt to our Utopia Station show, the legendary filmmaker Agnes Varda, who just passed away. I would like to remember her today. She passed away a few weeks ago. And Agnes Varda said, my entire life, I was only invited to film festivals. And it's so rigid, no? Because it has to be a film which is 80, 90 minutes, otherwise he cannot enter the competition, or maybe a short film, and then he can go into a short film. It's all in a box. And she says, in the art world, there was suddenly the freedom, because we invited her to the art exhibition in Venice, our Utopia Station, and she could suddenly have multi-screen environments, she could do a performance. So this incredible freedom of the format of exhibition, which you can see here, which Arthur Jafa uses, is a great opportunity to bring together different practices, but also to bring together, very importantly, different disciplines. And this bringing together is, of course, at the core of the practice of Édouard Glissant. And when Miguel mentioned to me in preparation of today's conference and tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, of this 3-day conference, that the theme will be the global. So it's not either or, it's both local and global. I thought I should talk here about Édouard Glissant, who for me is the most important thinker, toolbox, and inspiration for anything I do, and I think not only exhibitions, but just for life. And Édouard Glissant was a good friend of mine. He passed away in 2011. He was somehow my mentor. It's still unfortunately not translated a lot into Spanish. There need to be more translation. But he actually has created an extraordinary series of ideas which we can apply directly to exhibition making today. So whenever I wake up in the morning, early in the morning, I always read every day 50 minutes of Édouard Glissant. It's like it's a daily ritual. I believe in rituals. I mean, Tarkovsky once said, we need to invent rituals for our age, and I have many rituals. I buy a book every day, that's a ritual. But one ritual is, as soon as I wake up, I read 50 minutes of Édouard Glissant. And the reason why Glissant is so important, and here are a few letters he sent to me, is of course the idea of the archipelago. Because he said that continents are often homogenizing, whilst the archipelago is more sheltering, more welcoming. So we should think when we do museums about a logic of the archipelago, not just one homogenizing entity, but an archipelago. The other concept is, of course, mondialité, which we try to basically address in an exhibition we did with Assad Raza for Villa Ampin. And this exhibition happened actually last year and is still touring. Here you have Steve McQueen, or you have a portrait of Édouard Glissant by Mantia Diawara and Daniel Boyd. Now, what is mondialité? Édouard Glissant early on understood that basically we live in an age of globalization. Now, it's not the first time that the world faces globalization. There has been globalization in the Roman Empire. There have been many prior moments of globalization. But without a doubt, this very moment in time, the 19th year of the second decade of the first century of the third millennium, the moment we are living now, is without a doubt the most extreme and maybe also most violent moment of globalization. And the result is, of course, that many things disappear. 1 million species are endangered of disappearing. Elizabeth Kolbert talks about the sixth mass extinction. There is no doubt whatsoever we're in the middle of a mass extinction. And it's not only species which disappear, but also many cultural phenomena. There was a study that never in history have languages disappeared to the extent they disappear now. Many, many cultural phenomena disappear. So Glissant said we need to resist that. We need to resist homogenized globalization. But he observed, and that's the whole idea of mondialité, that there will be something else coming, and he saw that come already in the 70s. So he was really very prescient, or premonitory, prescient, because he said there will be a counter-reaction coming, a counter-reaction to globalization. And that counter-reaction will be new forms of lack of solidarity, new forms of nationalism, new forms of racism, and something we can observe as well at the moment. And he said we have to resist that as well, because we should not give up on this idea of a global dialogue between all of us. So that's why he coined this notion of mondialité, because he said we need another form of globalization. We need a global dialogue which is respectful of local differences, which is generous, and which can listen. Because, of course, the 20th century has been about many, many manifestos, very often loud manifestos. And he says, today we need more to listen to each other, to listen to other species, to listen to the planet, to listen, the quality of listening. So that's very, very important in mondialité. And I think in a way, we can apply this to almost everything we do. Exhibitions is one example, but it's possible to apply to many other fields. How can we all make on a daily basis a contribution which resists these two things and creates somehow a mondialité? And with exhibition making, it's relatively simple, I think, because we just need to think always about how can we further a global dialogue, but not homogenize, which means that we do less touring exhibitions where we ship artworks, from one city to the next. But when an exhibition tours, we listen to the local context and let the show evolve. Exactly like Do It does it, for example. Or now with Arthur Jafa, with our curator Amira Gad, his exhibition tours around the world, it's never twice the same. We listen to the local context, and the show is different in Stockholm than it will be in Portugal. It's different than it was in London. So that's just one example of how mondialité can be useful. Of course, Glissant also wanted to create an institution, and that makes him so relevant for any reflection we have today about the 21st century museum. Because not only is he the great philosopher and poet of our age, but also did he want actually to go into practical realizations of his ideas. So he founded a school, which became a school for Martinique, and he had this dream, together with his artist friends, Wilfredo Lam and Roberto Matta, who were the artists of his generation, to create an institute where all worlds could gather. So it wouldn't be a homogenized, synthetic archive of everything, but it would be a place where you would have many, many different archipelagos which would build bridges. And he's worked on that for many years, and there's a whole reservoir of ideas which I think we can use today and be inspired by. And that was the idea of this exhibition. Here you see, for example, Philippe Pareno's answer to Edouard Glissant's archipelago. And then, of course, if we want to address these big questions of the 21st century, extinction, climate change, I've mentioned inequality, I think we can only do that if we go beyond the fear of pooling knowledge, if we break down the silos which still exist in society, and if we bring together the different disciplines. And that leads us to the format of the marathon, also very inspired by Edouard Glissant, because Edouard Glissant always told me we need to bring together many languages, and we need to gather many disciplines, and break down segregations. So we started this in 2006 with the first marathon. Here you see the late Doris Lessing. And ever since, every year, we choose one topic and then address it from 50 different angles: art, science, architecture, music, literature. So, for example, here we had the Manifesto Marathon, Vivienne Westwood with her ecological manifesto. So every year there is a different theme. Or here the Transformation Marathon with Pina Bausch and Heiner Müller, performed by Dominic Gonzalez Förster. Or in the same Transformation Marathon, the late Binyavanga Vainaina, the amazing poet. So the theme of transformation. Or another year, Actually, last year we had the theme of work, because of course, looking at technology, looking at artificial intelligence, many artists talked about the disappearance of work. So we looked with Bernard Stiegler, and here also with David Adjel, Inetia Domboakier, and John Gray at the future of work. Or here you have Etel Adnan, who talks about extinction. And the theme of extinction is so important, I think, for the 21st century and also for museums, because I think it's so important that we can bring certain things back, but not in a static way, whilst transforming them. And that is definitely something which we will continue to explore, because these themes, of course, once we've dealt with them, are not, accomplished, but they continue to evolve, no? So it's an ongoing thing. And then, of course, the question is, how can we bring this interdisciplinarity back into the format of the exhibition, into the institution? And my friend Alex Poots was asked as the CEO and artistic director to do a new institution in New York called The Shed. So we came up with a prelude for that, where a young architect, Kunle Adeyemi, created a structure for all these practitioners here. You have rap music, you have dance, you have choreography, you have a school, and created this very flexible, movable structure where a performance by Bill Forsyth could turn into an artwork, and 10 minutes later you would have a conference. So it was a completely flexible space. And that's, of course, what The Shed as an institution attempts to do. It's a structure by Dilla Scofidio Renfro, which is on wheels and moves basically back and forth, occupies the ground only when it's needed, and where lots of projects can happen which bring the disciplines together. So one exhibition I curated there at the very beginning is the project of Gerhard Richter and Steve Reich and Avo Pärt, because we observed, and that's just one little example of what can happen, when we bring different disciplines together, is that usually we don't experience music and painting at the same time. It's usually, we go to listen to music in a concert hall, and then we go to see painting in the museum or in the gallery or in a private collection. Now, the idea here was that we wanted to do it all in one space. So Gerhard Richter developed a whole series of abstract works related to the patterns. And at the same time, we had live music by Avo Pärt and Steve Reich all day long. So here, for example, the choir of Avo Pärt is singing. You see the a cappella choir is singing. And it was a choir which was actually dispersed throughout the space. Throughout the space, you had these singers among the public, and you could experience them singing to you and at the same time, viewing the work by Gerhard Richter. And Richter created the work for Avo Pärt, and Avo Pärt created the work for Gerhard Richter. Another example next door, and one led to the next, was the collaboration between Steve Reich and Gerhard Richter. They have had an interest in each other since the 1970s, and late 60s, early 70s, Richter was interested by the minimal music of Reich, the early work. Reich was fascinated also by Richter's painting over many years. And so we brought them together, and together with Corinna Belz, Gerhard Richter developed a film of his pattern. So all of a sudden the pattern started to move, and he created a wallpaper, and you had an orchestra of playing Steve Reich's new composition. And that composition, again, was created for Richter, whilst Richter created the artwork in sync with the composition by Steve Reich. So it's almost like, when you think about Merce Cunningham and John Cage collaborating, they often didn't know what the other one would do, but at the end it came together. And here, of course, through email, they kept sending each other files, but they didn't know exactly what the other would do, but then they would catch up. So it's a very fascinating process. And again, you have to imagine that the orchestra played all day long. So this is not a concert, because it has opening hours like the museum. So people could come during the day to the museum, they could listen to a live music, and at the same time look at paintings. And the same thing is true for the a cappella choir of Avo Pärt, because the singers were there in shifts all day long. So, you enter the space, and at certain moments, half an hour later, whatever, it was sort of a time schedule, it would begin, and all day long. So that's just one example, what one can happen when little by little we start to bring these disciplines together. And that, of course, is very much at the core of my project from the very, very beginning, because I became a curator really because of Diaghilev. Because in a way, as a teenager, I was very fascinated by ballet russe and by the Rite of Spring. And I read a biography of the great Russian impresario Diaghilev. And, I'm often asked, who is the curator who inspired you most? And of course, I've been inspired by, many curators from history. I mean, I grew up in Switzerland. So of course, Harald Seemann was a great inspiration. Then for projects like Do It, which I showed you earlier, someone like Lucy Lippard was and remains an amazing inspiration, because she did exhibitions which are conceptual. She also addressed ecology very early on. So Lucy Lippard would be a big influence. And then, of course, I had mentors from whom I learned curating on a day-to-day job. Suzanne Paget, the French museum director who ran the Musée d'Art Moderne, actually, and now runs the LV Foundation. She taught me how to run a museum and how to do a program in the early 90s. And then there was Caspar Koenig, the impresario and curator in Germany, from whom I learned how to do a large-scale exhibition. So there's a lot of curators I learned from. And at the same time, I would say the biggest influence were, of course, always artists, because I think it's always listening to artists. And in terms of curating, the biggest influence was Diaghilev, because I was very fascinated. If you look at the Russian impresario Diaghilev's trajectory, it's very fascinating that he actually began as a painting curator. And then he realized that he wanted to bring all these fields together, and he realized that the ballet could be a way to do it. So he would work with artists like Picasso or Goncharova. He would work with the greatest dancers and choreographers of his time. He would at the same time commission Stravinsky to do the sound. So in a way, it's like a Gesamtkunstwerk. And I'm often asked, because I always ask artists, what is their unrealized project? So I'm often asked, what is my unrealized project? And there are, of course, many. One unrealized project is to somehow one day, and maybe this will never happen because it's very complicated, to do something like the Rite of Spring. Because if you think about this amazing constellation, how Diaghilev brought together these greatest creators of his time, and he created this Gesamtkunstwerk, it would be amazing if that could happen for our time. So that's one unrealized project. Another unrealized project is, of course, and that's very ironic, is to do a big exhibition of all the unrealized projects which I've archived. Because I have more than 2,000 unrealized artist projects I've archived through the interview project. But whenever I'm trying to do this exhibition, it somehow remains unrealized. So these, just a few more last remarks. I think talking about exhibition making and curating, I had a real conundrum about what to do with social media, because I never really felt comfortable with social media. So I never did Facebook and still do not do Facebook. And then at some point, as always, things started with artists. I was having breakfast in LA with the artist Ryan Trecartin, and Ryan took my phone and showed me how to download the app for Instagram. And I did not really realize what happened, but before I knew it, I was on Instagram. And then he sent a message to all his followers, basically saying that I had joined Instagram. So it's almost like, you're thrown into the water and then have to swim. So I didn't really know what to do for a long time with Instagram. I mean, I knew I wouldn't want to do selfies. I knew I wouldn't want to photograph food. So all of that was kind of clear. But I still didn't really know, what I should do. I was kind of lost with it. And then I was having, meetings with artists, and I asked them to somehow do an artwork for my Instagram, but it created this weird situation because no one knew what to do. How could one do art for Instagram? It was very confusing. So in any case, as often in my practice, it has to do with a flânerie, It's kind of like being on a walk. It's this idea of a series of inspirations. It's like a chain reaction somehow. We just have to be open. We have to be open for chance, I think. It's very, very important to be open for chance at all times. Control chance, in a way. And so I was sort of lost with my Instagram, and I went to see Umberto Eco for a completely different reason, the late Umberto Eco in Milano. And we visited his archive, because that is a whole other aspect one could talk about, the curation of archives. I've always been very interested in archives. And Umberto Eco, to my big surprise, started to talk about what we lose in our age of globalization. And he says that he's really very worried about civilization now because handwriting disappears, doodling disappears, like handwritten notes disappear, letter writing disappears. And particularly for art history, letter writing was so important. I had so many letter exchanges with artists like Maria Lasnik or Gustav Metzger. We sent each other in the 90s long letters, and you would have a letter on the table and you would continue to write the next day. It was very beautiful. And Umberto Eco made me aware that had somehow eclipsed. So he said it's your job to bring that back, which was a nice challenge. So then I left his house and I still didn't really know what to do. And then I realized that I'm with artists and architects every day. This is a very recent one, an amazing note from Norman Foster, which could almost be a motto, I think, why to work with art and why to curate. And so I realized that in my conversations with artists and architects, I could just ask them to handwrite a note or a doodle, and we could, through that, every day celebrate handwriting and doodling and make it a movement. So then social media would no longer be a vanity project, which was always the thing which bothered me about it, but it would have a use, it would have a utility. Because I always believe in this idea that curating has to be useful. It has to be useful to the art, to the artist, and to the world. That's the only reason why a curator makes sense, is to be useful. And so then I thought, how could we be useful with Instagram and make it into a movement which goes beyond the personal account, but becomes a movement to save and celebrate more, save and celebrate handwriting and doodling. And so ever since, I do this, here you have Norman Foster's very important message about the power of art as a cause for good. You have Genesis Breyer P. Orridge, who developed a own type of handwriting, a different, it's two handwritings are never the same. Or you have Faith Ringgold, who gives us the message that anyone can fly. Or Jonas Mekas, with a beautiful quote by Gertrude Stein. And then Ku Chong-a's doodle. So it's, handwritten notes, doodles, sketches. And then, of course, as often, and that goes back to what I said before, that exhibitions in that sense are organic. They continue to evolve. My artist friend Henri Sala said, I'm not on Instagram. Many artists don't want to be on Instagram. But he said, I could be on your Instagram, like in residence. So now, Henri is sending me a clock every week. It's like a clock. It's always a clock. It's Sala time. So in a way, it goes back, to the fridge. When we had the kitchen show, and then we had the fridge, and that's like an exhibition within the exhibition. We can say Henri Sala's clocks, and there have been about 80 so far, so it's a pretty big amount of clocks, and we're now doing a book. Henri Sala's clocks are like an Instagram within the Instagram. It's a Russian matryoshka. And then at a certain moment, we realized that, 2 is a company, 3 is a crowd, that maybe the rule of the game is a little bit narrow, because, and also very often I'm with a group of artists. Like yesterday, we were, having a meeting with 6 young artists here in Bilbao. So then I realized, actually, there is this more collective format of the exquisite corpse. This wonderful surrealist game, which the surrealists played, Breton started it, where basically you fold a piece of paper and then the others can't see what you do. You do a first thing, you connect, the next person connects, and then it gets magically unveiled. And it sort of always works. So then we started to do exquisite corpse, first with 2 people, then with 3 people, and now with many more. So that was one of the first exquisite corpse with the artist Alex Israel and the writer Brett Easton Ellis. Another artist in residence is Richard Tiravanit, who also has done many and now has actually started his own Instagram. Freedom cannot be simulated. And then, of course, many different disciplines, because, of course, for me, curating has always got to do that if we want to understand the forces which are in art, we need to understand what happens in other disciplines, in fashion, in music. I mean, here you have Virgil Abloh, in science, in architecture, whilst always being anchored in one world, because I am, of course, deeply anchored in the art world, but we always go to these other worlds. And that's Etel Adnan. And actually, she was quite instrumental also in getting this Instagram account on its way. And I mean, so far there have been several thousand, of these notes, and it's become a very big group show in a way. It's a conceptual group show which grows every day. And Etel Adnan was there at the very beginning because Umberto Eco had kind of given me the idea, but sometimes it's like with the letter, of Edgar Allan Poe, that it's in front of you, but you don't see it, no? And so Umberto Eco gave me the idea, but I kind of didn't see that could be my Instagram. And then we were with Etel Adnan and Ku Chong-an, Simone Fattal in a cafe in Bretagne. And it started to rain, as it very often rains in Bretagne. And the rain would not stop, and for hours. And so we found shelter in a cafe, and we were all having a great conversation. But then after like 3 hours, I would go on my phone and started to do some emails, and my partner Ku Chong-an would go on her phone, and Simone Fattal would go on her phone. But the 92-year-old poet and artist Etel Adnan would not go on her phone, no. She would open her bag, take out a piece of paper, and wrote this beautiful poem, no? And just watching her write this poem, that's when the penny dropped, That's when I thought, like, wow, I can just photograph this and film this. And so in a way, that's how this Instagram began. And I also think that her motto, that the world needs togetherness, not separation, love, not suspicion, a common future, not isolation, is a great segue, in a way, again, back to Edouard Glissant, because that's kind of a definition of what is mondialité. And then, of course, we have Luchita Hurtado, air, water, fire, world, earth, life. One of her, artworks she creates for demonstrations. At 98, she still demonstrates for the environment. And that's the last thing I wanted to show you, because we've talked a lot, about new experiments in art and technology, about this idea of a new form of art which is emerging with living organisms. I've tried to talk about formats of exhibition making, but I do believe that this aspect of memory is so important in relation to museums. It's of course so important in relation to a museum with a collection, and that's why I was so inspired yesterday when Miguel showed us the alphabet, because it is a rule of the game in a way, and exhibition making, as you could see hopefully in the talk, has a lot to do with rules of the game. We always come up with rules of the game in dialogue with artists, and these rules of the games create unexpected encounters. As here with the rule of the game of the alphabet, we can suddenly have a completely fresh new look on the collection and see totally unexpected encounters between older works and newer works. So that happens, of course, when a museum has a collection. We don't have a collection at the Serpentine. We are a Kunsthalle. So we are basically a laboratory, for new ideas. But we think it's very, very important in such a Kunsthalle to also address the theme of memory. So this summer, we have a double exhibition which lasts until autumn, so I hope you can all come and visit it. And one is by Luchita Hurtado. And Luchita Hurtado is an amazing artist who is now 98 years old. She was born in Venezuela and actually then moved, when she was very young, to New York, met Jackson Pollock, met Marcel Duchamp. She spent a lot of time with Tamayo. Tamayo painted in her kitchen. And Tamayo kind of became her painting teacher, and she also inspired Tamayo. It was reciprocity. And she then moved to Mexico with her then husband Wolfgang Paalen, the surrealist. She then moved to San Francisco. When her child passed away, she left Mexico, she went to San Francisco, became part of the circle around the Maton group. She was never part of any movement. She was fiercely, resolutely independent. She never was part of surrealism, but she was, of course, very close. She was not part of the Maton. And then in the 60s, she moved to LA and became part of the feminist and ecological movement very early on. So she almost has had like 4 or 5 lives. And she paints still every day at 98 and has never had a museum exhibition before. So at 98, this is her first show. And she always told me she always knew her time would come. And I think that is a very urgent thing, you know, institutions have to do. It's something which Eric Hobsbawm, the historian, the late Eric Hobsbawm, the very important English historian, he once told me when the first day I arrived in London in 2006, I met him, and he said we need to protest against forgetting. And I think it's not only we need to invent the future with fragments from the past, and we need to invent new experiments with art and technology, but we also need to protest against forgetting. And that's very much, you know, what Luchita Hurtado's exhibition is about. So you have 98 years of her life. She has painted for more than 70 years now in this exhibition. Another protest against forgetting is Faith Ringgold, another visionary artist, African-American artist, early on in the 60s, did extraordinary paintings about the civil rights movement. She grew up during the Harlem Renaissance in the 30s. Here you see some of these paintings from the 1960s. And then she realized that she also was a writer, but actually publishers would not want to publish her text. And there was this incident, and that's the last thing I'm going to tell you because I think I'm out of time. So she wanted to write her biography. And you have to imagine that the publisher tried to change her story. So she got like super upset. She says, this is my story. You cannot change my story. And then the publisher said, then I'm not going to publish your book. So then she says, and that goes back to do it, you know, that DIY spirit in which I believe so much, that we can fly and we just have to try. So she basically said, I'm going to do it anyhow without the publisher. And she invented this wonderful format of these foldable textile paintings on which she could write. So they became like her autobiography. And many, many people saw it because it became very public. And then not only that, not only got the biography published, but she was discovered by Random House who wanted to do children books. So millions of children grew up because she just did it. And I think the last thing, because it goes back full circle to the beginning, is when I show you these exhibitions of Faith Ringgold, and that's the post that she did for my Instagram, which is, again, anyone can fly. All you got to do is try. To the White House, women, let's go. And so basically, the same year when I met Alighiero Boetti and Fischli Weiss as a teenager, when I was 17, I met Rosemary Trockel. And she again gave me great advice. And I think that's the advice I always give to curators, that we have to listen to artists and to be close to artists. So Rosemary Trockel said, Louis Bourgeois has finally been discovered. So we're talking here about 1985. And Louise Bourgeois at that time just had her first museum shows. She was discovered very, very late. And Rosemary said, this is wonderful, but actually there are so many other extraordinary women artists of that generation who have not been visible. How important it would be to just go from city to city to city and ask, you know, who are pioneering artists who have not had the visibility they should have. And she says, I am an artist, but I cannot really do that because I'm exhibiting my own work. But this is, again, you know, like Boetti, she said that you could do that. It was like advice. And ever since, you know, whenever I go to a city, I would ask what I call the Rosemary Trockel question. And that's how in Los Angeles, you know, we met Luchita Hurtado, how actually in New York we met Faith Ringgold, how in Brazil we met many years ago Ligia Pape. So many exhibitions had to do with that. So anyway, that's just the beginning. Thank you all so much for being here. And thanks again to Miguel. Thank you very much.